Hey everyone, Eric here. Very quickly before we get to our discussion today with Mingwei Huang, I want to make sure that you know about the daily China-Africa email newsletter that Cobus and I put together. It's a comprehensive digest of everything going on in the China-Africa space. Everything from debt to diplomacy, tech, culture, it's all there. And then every story that we write for the newsletter is then indexed on our website, and it's now an amazing archive of thousands of articles with videos, links, graphics, all in one place. It's a great research tool. Subscriptions are super affordable, just $7 a month for students and teachers, $15 a month for everyone else. If you're interested in trying it out, just head over to chinaafricaproject.com/subscribe. You'll get 2 weeks free just to see if you like it. Once again, that's chinaafricaproject.com/subscribe.
The China and Africa podcast is brought to you in partnership with the Africa-China Reporting Project at Wits University in Johannesburg. The ACRP promotes balanced, considered reporting on Africa-China relations through innovative training programs held throughout the year. More information at africachinareporting.co.za.
Hello and welcome to another edition of the China in Africa podcast, a proud member of the Sinica Network from SupChina. I'm Eric Olander, and as always, I'm joined by Cobus van Staden, the senior China-Africa researcher at the South African Institute of International Affairs in Johannesburg, South Africa. A very good morning to you, Cobus.
Good morning.
Cobus, before we get to our show today, I want to make sure that we bring you an update about some of the Chinese COVID-19 vaccine developments in Africa, because there's been quite a bit of news this week, and it's rather important. And I just feel that's really important to update our podcast audience. We've been talking about this all week in our daily newsletter, and there has been some really interesting developments. First, that came out on Wednesday is that the Chinese government has arranged a deal between Cainiao, and Cainiao is the logistics arm of Alibaba. And I cannot emphasize how important this announcement is. Between Cainiao and Ethiopian Airlines, they've struck a deal to create what's effectively a cold chain distribution network that will transport vaccines from Shenzhen to Addis Ababa. They're going to be starting with twice weekly flights. And this is really now we're starting to see the architecture of what the distribution network is going to look like. This was one of the big questions. And the fact that the Chinese government has brought in such a heavy hitter like Cainiao to do it is an indication of the weight that they are attaching to this initiative. So these new, this air bridge, if you will be able to transport vaccines at minus 23 degrees Celsius. Now, that is another clue and another very important clue about the Chinese vaccine. So the Pfizer vaccine has to be refrigerated at minus 70 degrees. And that was always seen as a major impediment for developing countries in places like Africa, Latin America, and the Middle East because of the necessity of the cold chain that has to be maintained. Now, minus 23 is still very cold, but it is not minus 70. A couple other points here, Cobus. Ethiopia is the partner of choice. This is a very important distinction here. So Addis Ababa will be one of the hubs. Dubai is going to be another one. I think this was interesting because Ethiopia was the partner of choice for the Jack Ma Foundation when they were delivering PPE to every African country. It looks like they're going to build on the experience of that distribution effort that they did, and they're going to piggyback on that. Also, let's not forget they are creating vaccine production hubs in both Egypt and in Morocco. The one in Egypt is ready to go. The one in Morocco is still in development. They have not announced a vaccine production hub in sub-Saharan Africa, but that is probably going to come in the future as well. And remember, we said 2 weekly flights. Once the full manufacturing process of the vaccines gets full speed up in China, my guess is that we will see a lot more than just 2 flights a week coming in from China. But they're going to be producing both in Egypt, possibly in Morocco, as well as these flights from China. So, Cobus, that is really adding a lot of detail to the plans that we've been wondering. We still don't know about the cost and the availability. They're still in phase 3 clinical trials, but they are probably going to start coming out of that just as the Pfizer vaccine has now. What do you think about all this, Cobus?
I think it's very interesting to hear. I think it's very encouraging that Sanyao is involved because, as you pointed out in our newsletter intro today, actually, that they have a logistics operation that's literally larger than Amazon's. That they are the people who run the shipping on China's Singles Day shopping jamboree, which is billions of dollars worth of goods being shipped in a single day. So it's very encouraging. What I also think is it's going to be fascinating to see how this plays out geopolitically, because obviously the foundation built by China's China's PPE diplomacy, that we saw through 2020 built up in Africa will be. I mean, this will be so much bigger than that. So it's going to be fascinating to see how all of it shakes out, particularly in the larger context of all of the anxieties in Africa and other parts of the global south about when they'll be able to source vaccines and, the fear that the global north is going to be hoarding them. So, yeah, very interesting.
I mean, it's an indication that China is definitely seeing this opportunity in a bid to play to win. This is not a half-ass move that they're making by bringing in Sanyao. Sanyao's technology as well, and this is, again, Alibaba's technology, is used in Southeast Asia here on the Lazada platform. And this logistics intelligence that they bring is so critical, particularly in emerging markets, where it's not easy to do it. So they're bringing in really a very heavy hitter, and I just recommend for people to dig into this. But I would be very nervous if I was sitting in the State Department tonight watching this news. This is going to be potentially an enormous step. If China can deliver even 70% of the promise, 80%, like they don't even have to deliver fully on this thing, it will be a geopolitical win of what I called on Twitter today of staggering proportions. So that's my take on this, in part because I don't think the Europeans and the Americans are really in the game at anywhere near the level of what the Chinese look like they're doing. Again, there's a lot of details that we need to iron out. Okay, let's now shift gears. I just wanted to bring that update. Now let's shift gears to our discussion today about race and identity and architecture in Johannesburg. Now, Cobus, you are South African. Before we get into our discussion about race and identity, particularly in the Chinese community in South Africa, so much of what we're going to talk about today is based on the idea of apartheid. Now, for a lot of our listeners who are my age, I'm 50, you are about that age. I won't ask you on the radio.
I'm 46.
On the show. 46. Okay, there we go. We grew up when apartheid was still around. You lived in apartheid when you were a child.
As a child.
Yeah, and I think let's start our discussion today about race and identity in the Chinese community in South Africa with first an introduction as to what apartheid is, because a lot of our listeners were not alive, in fact, when apartheid was around. So can you just kind of map it out for us and talk to us about the totality of this racial systemic infrastructure that they had?
As a South African, I always get a little aggravated when people kind of throw around apartheid to simply either mean a separateness between two different groups or simply racism. And of course, those two aspects were very, very key to apartheid. But to think of it's something closer to the Jim Crow system in the US, in the sense that it was an entire economy that was run on forcing certain groups of people into certain labor categories that they couldn't escape from. And those labor categories were racially categorized. So, it was essentially setting up an entire country's labor system on the back of making it almost impossible for the majority of the population to become socially mobile. So, it's really important to it's really important for South Africans to keep, kind of digging up, kind of new ways of thinking about apartheid and rethinking apartheid, because it structures every aspect of life in South Africa at the moment, in the same way that Jim Crow still structures life in parts of the US. But the difference being that in South Africa it wasn't a simple black-white division as it was in the South in the US. It was a more complicated racial division, which ended up then really kind of impacting on daily life, in countless ways. And it set up whole ways of thinking, whole ways of talking, and particularly as we look at today, whole ways of building the city, of structuring the city, that South Africans still have to kind of negotiate their way around today. And this is one of the issues that we dealt with in this new book.
Okay, let's talk about that book. It's called Anxious Joburg, The Inner Lives of a Global South City. It was actually edited by yourself and Nikki Falkoff. It was printed by Wits University Press. If you go into the table of contents and head down to chapter 7, you're going to see a chapter called The Chinatown Backroom, The Afterlife of Apartheid. And now you'll see why we wanted you, Cobus, to do this introduction to apartheid. It's written by Mingwei Huang, an old friend of the show. The last time she was on the show was back in 2015. For those of you not familiar with Mingwei, she's an assistant professor of women's, gender, and sexuality studies at Dartmouth College in New Hampshire, and joins us from a very chilly morning in Vermont. A very good morning to you, Mingwei, and welcome back to the show.
Hi, Eric. Hi, Cobus. Thanks for having me.
It's wonderful to have you on the program again and to talk about the chapter in the book. It's a fascinating read, and I'm hoping that a lot of people will be able to read it. Let's start with a little bit of background about the Chinese diaspora and the Chinese community before we get into the details of your chapter. You talk about how South Africa is home to the oldest and largest Chinese diaspora in Africa. The population's estimated between 300 and 350,000, although people really don't know an exact number. And the roots go all the way back to the 19th century and even before. Tell us a little bit about the population that's there before we get into the details of what you were writing about in the chapter.
Sure. So I started my research in 2013, and this kind of segment of the Chinese community in South Africa I work on are kind of what people often think of as the new migrants, people who came after 1998, the year that South Africa and the PRC normalized relations. So I look at, now it's been like 20 years, but, this kind of the new migrants that came largely from Fujian province, Guangdong province. Many became kind of small-scale traders in Johannesburg, where I did my research. So that's kind of so with the large kind of diasporic population, you had earlier waves of the Taiwanese and the people from Hong Kong, and then you have like 3-4 generations of South African-born Chinese. So my work is on that kind of the new wave, and what I'm really interested in is kind of situating new Chinese migration within, this kind of post-apartheid through various different layers of history in South Africa.
So you spent a lot of your time in a suburb called Cerreldene, which is kind of one of the kind of a new prominent Chinatown in Johannesburg. Can you tell us a little bit about what your fieldwork entailed and what Cerreldene is like?
Yeah, so Cerreldene was a suburb kind of built in the late 1930s, and before Chinese moved in the 90s, it was a largely, I believe, Jewish and Portuguese suburb, but it was kind of built as a place, kind of a more affordable place for in the northern suburbs, kind of a respectable, safe kind of suburb for people who couldn't afford some of the other northern suburbs. But it's on the east side of the city. So my work started out doing field work with these traders in Johannesburg's China malls. So it's particular, I think, to kind of big cities. When I was in Cape Town, there were far fewer of these malls, and I think a lot of it has to do with kind of we'll talk about it, but kind of the terrain of security in Johannesburg. And there just are so many more traders, Chinese traders in Joburg, so you get these big wholesale shopping complexes. So I started there, and one of the mall owners, kind of one of these prominent Chinese businessmen, I wanted to initially some of these malls have apartments on site where traders live. Again, a lot has to do with the securitization of life in Joburg. But I wanted to do my field work, at this mall and live at the mall. And I had the okay to do so. And then, without letting me know, the business, this mall owner actually, when I arrived in Joburg, said, well, you're actually going to live with my friend, who is the boss of Chinatown. So that's how I ended up there. So I lived with the man who had managed Chinatown for over a decade. So I lived there, and that's the house that I write about. And then I also was doing ethnographic fieldwork at this mall, and I worked at the two different shops. And I ran someone's shop when they were in China for about a month. So I really kind of got into kind of the really mundane aspects of everyday life for Chinese traders, kind of working in these malls, and then also kind of living among traders and trader families in Cyril Dean. And then eventually I did live at that mall apartment after all. So it was kind of a very long, immersive process.
But this man who you, in the book, gave him the name Mr. Zheng, he's not just a businessman, and he had a much bigger role in the community. Give us a little about the colorful background that he has.
Well, he is quite, I won't get into too many details. I'm kind of working on it for the book, but he is quite a important kind of local figure among traders, especially kind of among Fujianese. So he was pretty integral with helping people get set up with kind of immigration processes, and also just getting started. When people first arrive, Cyril Dean is often kind of the kind of touchdown point for people who kind of first arrive in Johannesburg. So he was quite integral in the making of this migration wave, with kind of arranging to bring people over, and kind of getting them sorted out with kind of immigration documents. And whenever there were any kind of, say, community disputes, or just any sorts of these sorts of issues, he was kind of within a handful of kind of local business leaders who would kind of be these kind of touchstones within the Chinese community. So for ordinary migrants, they don't have much connection with the state, whether that's the South African government, or with the Chinese embassy in Johannesburg. So usually, these sorts of, there might be like 10 Chinese kind of business leaders who are these kind of important figures within the community. So he was one of them. And the mall owner who introduced me to him was another one of them. So I was able to kind of learn a little bit more about that world, and then also kind of with the traders, who are kind of in this hierarchy, a level or two below.
You've mentioned Fujian and Fujianese, and not everybody may be familiar with the geography and the population. Fujian province is in southeastern China. It's also historically been a main emigration point out of China to places like San Francisco and New York have large Fujianese populations, as well as in many parts of Africa, including Johannesburg. Cobus, go ahead.
So, one of the main themes of your chapter is architecture, and particularly the way that architecture kind of manifests South Africa's weird, mixture of like racial anxiety and, anxieties about crime and so on. I wonder if you could talk about the way that the house has been designed and redesigned, and particularly also, lay out what a maid's room is and what the significance of the maid's room is in that house.
Right. So this house, like I mentioned before, was built in the probably 1930s, 1940s. So what was quite standard with a lot of suburban homes in Johannesburg was there was kind of a whole kind of back quarters, servants' quarters, as they might be called before, the maid's room, that was, consisted of, say, an outhouse, kind of a small separate room where one or two live-in domestic workers might live. And so that was usually separate. It was in the yard. It was, sometimes, covered up by bushes, or it was behind the main house. And often, so other scholars of kind of architecture in Joburg have written about it, but, usually, the living room is kind of, front facing. And then the kitchen is at the back of the house. It's, separated with maybe a little yard, and then it's the kind of the maid's room, right? So the idea of a live-in domestic worker, a Black South African woman would have most access to, that back of the main house and be the least visible. So it's the way that kind of architecture enshrined the place of domestic labor in kind of suburban Johannesburg or South Africa. To be, domestic labor was essential. It was integral to the functioning of a household. It was, key to white middle class domesticity, but it also needed to be kind of out of sight as much as possible. So it wasn't even within the house. I think some of the other reasons why it was separate was because of these anxieties around. Before, during the colonial period, it was called the Black Peril panic, this fear that, domestic workers or, kind of African workers in the house were potential kind of criminal or sexual threats, right? This was kind of like white settler panic. So for all these reasons, these suburban houses, if you look, they'll have, there'll be like a little room to the back of the yard. And your co-editor, Nikki Falkhoff, wrote a really great piece that really helped me kind of think about this when I was doing my field work. A lot of these new houses have kind of converted those little back rooms into, garden cottages, and they rent them out. But that has a lot to do with the legacy of these rooms and kind of what they stand for, these kind of colonial and, hyper-racial relations of servitude, right? And they're also gendered. It's largely Black women, historically South African, but also more and more kind of Southern African migrant women who do this work of running households in often these less visible positions. So I think a lot of these houses have kind of tried to get rid of those back rooms or, not rely on live-in domestic labor. But here in this Cyril Dean Chinatown house that I ended up in, what's really interesting about it is, Mr. Zhang, he bought this house, in the early 2000s, and he really kind of rebuilt it for the needs of, Chinese traders who are often much more transient, right? They have They have families and homes in China. They kind of go in and out. Sometimes their family members join them. Sometimes they pick up and leave and they go somewhere else. So for a lot of these kind of wholesale family businesses, their housing situations can be quite kind of transient, right? So he had this huge house and he kind of built it out to accommodate some extra rooms and also rented a lot of those rooms out to other people. So there are all of these kind of traders, mostly people from Fujian province, milling around in his house, and me. And then he also had, several family members, kind of extended family members. But what took me, and the Chinatown office was also kind of built around, I think what he did was he physically built kind of structures around the exterior to enlarge it. So the Chinatown office used to be just like annexed to that living room. But what was interesting is I realized that there was a live-in domestic worker who I write about there. I call her Sarah. But she lived in what used to be, or what still is, kind of a back room. But it was harder to recognize it as such because he had kind of filled in that yard space that has typically separated the back room from the main house. And that middle space was kind of this, it looks very much like a kitchen that you would find in China, with the big kind of, the big propane tanks, and the woks, and it's a very familiar space if you've seen kitchens in China. And I haven't been to China in a long time, but it reminded me of my grandparents, their kitchens, of the kind of kitchen spaces I've seen in China. So this house is really this interesting kind of hybrid of these. It's a very distinctively kind of Johannesburg suburban house, but then also very distinctively kind of a space for Chinese traders, who kind of live a bit transiently and, do things like cook communal meals. So that's kind of the peculiar kind of house I lived in.
South Africa is a lot like the United States in that race permeates everything, and it's inseparable from almost every aspect of life. And I'm curious about continuing our discussion on architecture. How does the architecture, the physical external spaces, exterior spaces, inform us about the racial dynamics today in South Africa and in Johannesburg from your research? Because you have these great pictures in your chapter about the exteriors, and you talk to that. How does that inform us about where Chinese are vis-a-vis other racial groups within the racial hierarchy of Johannesburg?
Well, with the kind of built environment and the exteriors, I think, and Cobus mentioned this earlier, I think, the city was really built around, these racialized labor flows, right, that built the city. And after apartheid, I think there have been attempts to kind of integrate the city, right, across race and class. And I think Cyril Dean is another one of those places where it's kind of grappling with the kind of architectural legacies of apartheid, of all this kind of intense racial and class segregation, but also something new is kind of taking shape there. Basically, since Chinese migrants have moved in, and I think a lot of the literature that I read on Johannesburg, a lot of it revolves around a kind of black-white kind of color line or binary. And I think new Chinese migrants certainly, step into this really complicated racial terrain, and then kind of locate themselves in it, sometimes rather kind of unwittingly. But they're also read within those kind of racial categories and racial hierarchies. So, race has always been complicated in South Africa, and it continues to be today. And I think one of the things that is, structures my line of inquiry with much of the work I do is when you have kind of new Chinese migrants who don't quite fit that, the black-white binary. I think a lot of racial relations, have kind of grappled with where to situate, whether Chinese Americans, Asian Americans in the U.S., or Asian people in South Africa. But it's also complicated because they come in after 1994. They don't quite know the kind of racial histories and racial relations, but they're in it. And they're kind of read as sometimes like white, but also, kind of othered as, the Chinese. So they are also somewhere in this mix of hierarchies. And I think that the Chinatown backroom is a good, it's rare, right? In the book chapter, I write that it's not like there are a ton of these all over Cyrildine, but that particular house is a good way of, it's a symbol of what the kind of ambiguities around where to place new Chinese migrants in the kind of the racial relations and the kind of the real physical material remains of apartheid. So they kind of, right, new Chinese migrants kind of step into this racial terrain, and then they kind of make something out of it. And how we interpret it can still be it's still quite ambiguous, what to make of it. It's really like there's all of these kind of historical entanglements and kind of and murk around how to think about it.
So one of the aspects of the book that many different contributors touch on in different ways is this issue of how Johannesburg people talk about crime, and then very frequently Johannesburg crime talk is coded in complicated ways to also refer to lots of other things, including race, particularly race. And you like in your chapter you highlight this really fascinating situation where frequently these traders would work with African, Black African, South African, and from elsewhere on the continent, workers in their shops, and develop very long relationships with them. But then the relationships don't really, it's not a situation where the relationship really warms over time. In fact, in many cases, as it goes on, the relationship just gets more and more bitter. And there's all of this paranoia about crime being an inside job and kind of having these kind of this kind of anxiety about these kind of intimate working relationships between different races, kind of with this constant fear of being sold out to criminals by these same people you're working with. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about these kind of racial dynamics and how, kind of how Chinese kind of race and crime talk differs from other South Africans.
Yeah, so crime talk really it's about something else, and often it's about race. Sometimes it's, a way to express, frustration with kind of the perceived failures of the state or, police to kind of protect property. But among Chinese, I think crime talk does two things, or it kind of indexes two different things. There's kind of the idea of, and of course it's racialized, it's, the idea of kind of black criminality writ large, that has to do with, I think, Chinese traders being afraid in public space, whether that's a shopping mall or that's driving on the street. Or, I think that indexes something about how Chinese migrants feel about being in a global South city, in an African city. It's how they think about Johannesburg. Something I heard again and again. Johannesburg is they would use the word luan, like it's like a disorderly or backwards place. So the idea when they talk about crime, and particularly kind of armed robberies, they're talking about kind of this kind of straw man, this idea of Black criminality in kind of a disorderly global South city, where they see police as, people who harass them, not protect them. But as you mentioned, crime also kind of, it's a way that I think people talk about labor relations, and this kind of anxiety and this paranoia around like an inside job. So, and that's especially with kind of employees who have kind of worked with traders for a long time. So, it indexes two things. And so with the kind of bitterness, so you'll have at these malls, most of the shop workers at these malls in Johannesburg, you'll have like maybe one or two Chinese workers, depending on the size of the shop. And then you'll have, sometimes 3 or 4, sometimes 1, sometimes a dozen, mostly migrant workers, undocumented, from Malawi and Zimbabwe, who are dependent on, Chinese employers, who will give them steady employment when they don't have papers. So, they work very low wages and often for a very long time, and that can lead to, real bitterness and resentment. So I think with Chinese employers, because this happens every now and then, I think crime and talk of crime is quite outsized. But, a few kind of high-profile incidents will really kind of shake traders. And so I think there is this fear that kind of the workers will avenge, their conditions of exploitation and being being grossly underpaid. So a lot of the fear with crime, it's kind of this broad kind of racial stereotypes of Black criminality, and then also this much closer fear of the inside job that, it's because of the labor conditions. But there's this other kind of nested contradiction within crime. So I think crime and anxiety are really fascinating ways to think about sociality in Johannesburg, but also, China-Africa relations, like this podcast examines. Because crime really is a way of indexing labor. And one of the other nested contradictions within there is sometimes the anxiety is actually about competition with other Chinese or crime from, for a long time in Johannesburg, the Chinese, mafia underground world was something that people really contended with in Chinatown, in Cyrildene. Sometimes there's fear of betrayal of, Chinese workers stealing from you or, becoming your business competitor. So there was actually paranoia kind of moving in all sorts of directions around money, around crime. But I think most of it was kind of placed into this kind of figure of Black criminality. And people rarely ever really talked about kind of crime within kind of the Chinese community. And then also, so when you think about domestic work, I mean, in South Africa in general, there always is, worry that whenever something happens, it's an inside job. It was, a domestic worker's boyfriend, or perhaps she did it herself, or, it was the gardener. So, that fear of the inside job, that traders have at these malls, plus the kind of paranoia around inside jobs that come with domestic labor, those kind of, converge in this situation.
Let's pull back the lens a little bit just as we start to wind down our discussion and look at the question of assimilation, because when we talk about Chinese migration to Africa, a lot of Africans and then others who are looking at this issue question whether first-generation Chinese are able to assimilate in Africa? And this becomes a very complicated question in a place like South Africa, because as you've noted in your research for many years, the population in South Africa dates back centuries. In fact, if I'm correct, I think the British brought over Chinese to work in South Africa dating back during the British colonial period. And so that question of assimilation, you'll have people who are 4th, 5th, 6th, 7th, 10th generation Chinese in South Africa, on top of these new migrants that you talk about who've come in the post-94 era. How do we talk about assimilation, and what does this tell us about generally speaking, in terms of Chinese migrant assimilation in Africa, more general?
So you do have multiple generations and the newer migrants, and they don't really interact very much. And there are a couple writers like Ufreda Ho, the journalist and author of Paper Sons and Daughters, writes about this in her memoir too, about kind of feelings about, or just a kind of a disconnect with the new kind of new arrivants, and the kind of new migrants, they don't really see themselves, or they don't quite connect with the older generation. So they'll refer to kind of South African born Chinese as, Hua Chao or, Lao Chao. So the idea of like kind of a diaspora community. And they refer to themselves as like Chinese people. So their kind of sense of home and connection is still kind of rooted in the mainland. And I think for them, Johannesburg, whether you're, I met with, people who had been in Joburg for, only a couple months to over 10 years and had permanent residence. But even then, Joburg, interestingly, is not kind of where people really, see themselves in the future. It's kind of, it's like a place where they are. Also in my house in Cyrildene, it was quite interesting. There would be, a Fujianese couple who had been in Joburg for a decade, but all of a sudden they picked up and they moved. They went to Argentina because a lot of traders started leaving Johannesburg because the market had just been so saturated, and people talked about crime, and the currency exchange rates were less favorable. So people kind of pick up and move to other locales. People were going to Ghana, Mozambique, the DRC from trading in Johannesburg. So people are kind of looking for kind of greener pastures. So I think for the newer migrants, even I don't think Johannesburg is kind of where they really see themselves and where they're trying to, really integrate. But at the same time, they are really integrating. They do, make new lives there, and it maybe just doesn't quite fall into kind of how we think about assimilation. But I think that also with my own work of thinking, when I was spending all this time in Cyrildene, is this Johannesburg or is this something else? But it really is something that is, this world that I call Chinese Johannesburg, that is Johannesburg, even when it seems a little touch and go. So the long answer to your question about assimilation is perhaps yes, people are, but it's like less recognizable. But I think the attachments to being in South Africa is still quite loose.
Nikki and I recently did an interview with Judd Devermont at CSIS, and Marielle Harris, I think is her surname. Sorry, if I'm messing that up. About for a program where they focus on African urbanism. And they asked us, which turned out quite a tricky question. What kind of insights or lessons from one can take by looking at Joburg which kind of lessons can one apply into looking at North America, for example? So obviously you've spent a lot of time in North America. You've spent a lot of time here in Johannesburg. Like how has being in Joburg and looking so closely at this kind of experience in Joburg, how has that shifted your view of the US?
Oh, that's a great question. I think you stumped me there.
Mutually stumped.
I think that's definitely a stumper. I really appreciate in the introduction that you and Nikki Falkoff wrote. Joburg is an interesting place, and it's probably the most written about African city. And it almost feels like, what is there new to say about Joburg? But also, people have endless things to say about London or LA or Shanghai, Joburg is kind of the city that kind of keeps shape-shifting. We should continue to study it. I'm not sure if this is really quite answering your question, but I will say, at least, in this little experience in the world in Chinese Joburg, it's really where, multiple kinds of urbanism is coming together. So the way I write about it or think about it in the chapter, it's, my reading of this space was really informed by, the little time in my adult life that I have spent in China, and kind of the layout of a house. It also is, you might think about kind of other ways that people live in China, the walls and kind of new gated communities and how that converges with kind of the gated community and the walled compounds in Johannesburg. But I think every time I come back to the U.S. from a stint of fieldwork in Joburg, I feel like my relationship to the city changes. I think also, the adrenaline, that is the experience of being in Joburg. You kind of go back to other North American cities, or now in Vermont. I can't even say I'm in a city.
What a contrast from Vermont to Joburg. I mean, for those of you not familiar with Vermont, there's you're probably one of the only non-white people in the state, and there's just trees everywhere. So,
yes, it is a very it's quite a 180 to go from Vermont to Johannesburg, but I think about Johannesburg all the time when I'm in, and it's funny also I really miss the kind of the pace of life in Johannesburg. And I think Joburg does have a lot to teach us about city life. So, you stumped me on the question, but I think it is really a very particular place to be in. And I think Cyril Dean is also one of these like very peculiar kind of places that I went to Cyril Dean thinking I would find something like a Chinatown in the U.S. But I think there's something. I think the Chinatown, the historic, the first Chinatown in Johannesburg is a little bit more like a it's a smaller version of it, like a New York city Chinatown that's a bit more established. But Cyril Dean is kind of its own world with lots of different layers.
More subdued as well, I find. The American Chinatowns in New York and Los Angeles and San Francisco tend to be more visually expressive. And in Johannesburg, I found them to be more conservative, on the outside at least.
Yeah, there's a lot of, like, I got a sense, like, there are whole worlds, multiple nested worlds within Cyril Dean. And I think I, maybe cracked a couple of them, but there's a lot more going on that meets the eye,
It's also nested and hidden because everything in Johannesburg is also about breaking lines of sight. That's why it's such a walled city. It's all about like hiding things, not showing things, not exposing yourself visually. So so you never know what's going on behind all these walls, and I think that's particularly true in sort of
the book is Anxious Joburg: The Inner Lives of a Global South City, edited by Nikki Falkoff and none other than Cobus van Staden. Cobus, is the book available yet?
Yes, it's available from Wits University Press in South Africa, and then globally through NYU Press.
And is there a digital version of it so people can download it?
Yes, there's a Kindle version on Amazon.
Okay, so when you buy your Kindle version, please tell me it's not like $150.
It's academic prices, but we fought them down, so it's not as crazily expensive.
Okay, good. So when you get your Kindle version, then scroll down to the chapter 7, which is the Chinatown Back Room, The Afterlife of Apartheid by Mingwei Huang. Mingwei is an assistant professor of women's, gender, and sexuality studies at Dartmouth College, an old friend of ours and the program. Mingwei, thank you so much for getting up early to join us on the program all the way from Vermont. We really appreciate it. Hopefully it will not be 5 years again before you join us for another time on the show. We really appreciate your time today.
Thank you.
Cobus, you edited the book. Mingwei's chapter was just one chapter within a much larger narrative that you were in. How did it fit within the other chapters in the story that you were trying to tell with this book?
Well, we started the book originally because we were very interested in this situation where if you look at global South cities from the global North, they're almost always seen as some kind of problem to solve. It's like if you think about the way that for example, like Tijuana, for example, or Medellin, or like other kind of cities in Latin America, are seen from the perspective of North America. For example, they're almost always seen as this kind of like source of problems, or like a problem themselves that needs to be solved. So we were obsessed about what does it mean to be in Johannesburg, and then particularly also what is it, why is it important, I think, when you think about cities, to also think about the emotions you feel in the city. So we decided to focus on anxiety rather than fear, for example, because anxiety has this aspect to it where it's kind of free floating. You can feel anxiety about lots of things at the same time without being particularly fearful of something specific. And so that kind of anxiety, I think that is the default, kind of experience of 2020, I think, for the whole world, is that kind of free floating, like underlying hum that you feel, you just don't feel 100% at ease, even as you go about kind of anodyne tasks. So that is life in Johannesburg. That is kind of, that feeling is magnified by being in Johannesburg. And so we were then pulling in lots of different voices. Because Johannesburg is such a complex city, with so many different communities, so many different ways of living, it's a city literally where within less than a kilometer apart you could have one kind of person who is like works at an ad agency and has a cocaine problem, and someone else who is living with her entire family and another family in a single room where everyone is dependent on one single government grant, for example, to survive. So like those kind of experiences are all kind of squished together into the city, kind of where everyone is feeling anxious all the time. So we ended up kind of pulling in all of these different voices, like both established academics like Mingwei and Derek Hook, for example, like younger early career academics, and then non-academic voices from photographers, journalists. We have one series of stories by a professional storyteller who just simply looks at the anxiety of being a woman in Johannesburg, like dealing with Johannesburg's very annoying public transportation system. So it's all of these different perspectives trying to kind of do so in a way that the complexity of Johannesburg is also reflected in the complexity of the book. So we essentially weave all of these different voices together through the theme of anxiety and through the theme of Johannesburg.
But how much of the anxiety is tied to race? Now, I've only been to Johannesburg 3 times, I think. Yeah, 3 times. And what I've noticed was when I'm around white people, the conversation, even if you don't know them, within 5 minutes, the conversation descends defaults to crime all the time. I mean, just without fail. And then when I'm with black people, it doesn't come up as much, and there's not anywhere near as much anxiety. Now, that might, again, my experience is very limited. Is that consistent with your experience that people have a different perception of fear and anxiety based on race?
Yes, that's definitely a kind of a through line, and that kind of, as we also mentioned in conversation with Mingwei, crime talk is almost always talk about something else as well. It's a kind of a placeholder for a whole bunch of other anxieties, including things like anxieties around the failure of the state. Keep in mind that I agree with you that frequently white South Africans tend to be a lot more like talkative about crime, that they tend to harp on crime. Lots of South Africans harp on crime, but for white South Africans particularly, but that is happening in the context where black South Africans suffer disproportionately from crime. So they, being black in South Africa means that you're much more of a target for criminals actually than white people, among others, because frequently white people are so behind many different fences and walls and security gates. But it's also, it's a kind of it's a stand-in for a bunch of complicated anxieties, and who you are really inform what you're anxious about. So for example, like all of we have contributions from people who work with transgender migrants from other African countries who end up in Johannesburg, or with people who live in an area very far out on the side of Johannesburg where the entire neighborhood is run by these gangs who are busy with like illegal small-scale gold mining. So they kind of go down into these old disused mine shafts and kind of and mine for gold, and then menace the rest of the community to keep them away from their mine shafts. So there's all of these kind of crazy like little enclaves in Johannesburg which are all ruled by different kinds of anxiety. And then frequently crime talk would be this kind of like layer that covers everything. And like in each case, when you talk to these different people, they mean something slightly different when they complain about crime.
So if this is a topic that you are interested, there's two people that I would like to recommend you read. Number one is journalist April Zhu, who lives in Nairobi, and she talks a lot about the same issues that Mingwei raised in terms of gender, identity, migration, also marginalized populations. Go to aprzhu.com. You'll find all of her writing on that topic. Excellent, and very much aligned with what Mingwei talks about. Also, Yunjung Park, who is the Associate Director of the China-Africa Research Initiative. She's an old friend of ours in the program. She's very well known in the China-Africa scholarly community, but she's one of the foremost experts on Chinese migration and assimilation in South Africa and the history of it. Is there anybody else that you could recommend if people are interested in the Chinese population and the diaspora population in South Africa that they should follow?
I would suggest they also follow Karen Harris. She's at the University of South Africa. She does amazing research about the deep history of Chinese migration to South Africa, like pointing out that they were already Chinese migrants in Cape Town in the 1700s, and they were getting into fights with local populations about them kind of outworking and out-earning local populations. So, she's an incredible kind of archival researcher looking at kind of like old South African history.
We will put links to all three of those experts in addition to a link to the book that Cobus edited and that Mingwei wrote a chapter in. It's absolutely really amazing reading. I can't recommend it enough. And it really gives that historical context and perspective that is missing from so much of the current discussion on China-Africa relations writ large. So that'll do it for this edition of the China and Africa podcast. Cobus and I do a daily email every day, and we also do a free weekly email. We would love for you to sign up for either one just to get part of this discussion. So if you enjoyed the podcast and you really want to do a deep dive, go to our website, ChinaAfricaProject.com. Right there at the top, you'll see a sign up for the the weekly email. And then if you go to ChinaAfricaProject.com/subscribe, there's a big subscribe button right there on the homepage. You'll get a deep dive, the most comprehensive daily digest of China-Africa news on every subject. We really try to cover the breadth, everything from the type of research that Mingwei is doing to what we're talking about right now with the vaccines and the geopolitical implications of it, debt, racism, the situation that happened earlier this year in Guangzhou. Basically, any China story that comes up and China-Africa story that comes up, we do a full analysis of it on that day in the newsletter. Again, ChinaAfricaProject.com/subscribe. We've kept the subscription price intentionally very low to make it as accessible as possible. Just $7 a month for students and teachers, $15 a month for everyone else. So that'll do it for this edition of the show. Cobus and I will be back again next week with another episode. For Cobus Van Staden in Johannesburg, I'm Eric Olander. Thank you so much for listening.
The discussion continues online. Head over to facebook.com/China Africa Project to share your thoughts on today's show. The guys are also on Twitter, where you can find Cobus at Stadinsky or Eric at eOlander. And be sure to sign up for the weekly China in Africa email newsletter by going to www.ChinaAfricaProject.com.